The first snow fell silently over the barbed wire, drifting across the empty guard towers like ash from some forgotten fire. Under the pale morning light, a column of German nurses, young women hardened by years of war, bombings, and death, marched through the gate of Stalag 9B expecting to see the usual vision of Allied prison camps: disease, starvation, bodies stacked in trenches. Instead, they stopped. Their boots froze in the mud, because the camp did not smell of rot, but of soap. Because the prisoners did not look like skeleton, but men. And because, for the first time since 1939, these German women, trained to believe the enemy was barbaric, found themselves staring at something impossible: American medical tents cleaner than most German hospitals, prisoners treated with dignity, and American guards who saluted a sick German soldier as if he were their own. Snow slipped from the brim of a nurse's cap as she choked on a breath she didn't know she was holding. She would write in her diary later, "We expected brutality. We found humanity, but war has a cruel sense of irony, because what they discovered that day was not just cleanliness, not just food, not just order. It was the weapon the Reich never prepared for. American mercy." The war had been burning for 6 long years, and Europe was a carcass picked clean by fire and steel. By late 1944, the German war machine was breaking apart, bloodied in the east, strangled in the west, starved from the air. Every hospital from Hamburg to Munich overflowed with shattered men, amputated limbs packed in metal buckets, nurses collapsing on the floor from exhaustion. Medical supplies were measured in drops, food in crumbs, bandages washed and reused until they turned the color of dried rust. So when the Red Cross ordered a team of German nurses to inspect a series of American-run camps holding German POWs, most expected horror. They weren't naive. They had seen what happened in the East. They had watched men return from battles in the Ardennes, not as soldiers but as ghosts. They knew what a prison camp looked like: starvation, filth, disease spreading faster than bullets. They predicted the Americans would be no different, maybe worse. They traveled by truck through ravaged villages, past farms burned black, past churches shelled into piles of ancient stone. Snow blew in through the broken windows of their transport, stinging their cheeks. The youngest nurse, Irmgard Weiss, only 19, whispered into her scarf, "We must treat the prisoners, even if they are ours." Her voice trembled not from fear of the Americans, but fear of what she would find on the other side of the wire. When they arrived at Stalag 9B, the camp loomed like every prison they'd ever seen. Guard towers, double fences, machine gun nests, dogs barking in the cold. But something was off. The American sentry at the gate wasn't drunk or screaming orders. He simply checked their papers, tipped his helmet, and said, "Ma'am." Such a small word. But no one in wartime Europe had been called ma'am in years. Inside the camp, the nurses braced for rot, the humid stink of infection. Human waste, unwashed bodies, but instead the air was sharp, cold, clean. Men were lined up at a wash station, scrubbed with soap until the water ran the color of mud. Their uniforms were worn but mended, their faces thin, yes, but alive. American medics worked with quiet precision, treating frostbite, pneumonia, shrapnel wounds. Buckets of boiling water steamed beside sterilized tools. Blankets hung drying in neat rows. Every man had a bed. Every bed had a blanket. One German nurse whispered, almost angry, "Why would they care for our men like this?" An older medic, an American from Wisconsin named Corporal Samuel Pierce, overheard her. He looked up while wrapping a wounded wrist and answered in accented German, "Because someone has to stop the dying." He wasn't making a speech. He said it with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many bodies on too many fields. The nurses saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't kindness. It was duty. A duty their own country had long forgotten. Irmgard found herself drawn to a small medical tent where a group of German soldiers sat eating hot soup. Some were barely older than she was, boys taken from schools and farms sent to fight against tanks with rifles from another century. One soldier had his leg propped on a crate. His foot was gone, but he was smiling, holding a tin cup of coffee as if it was a miracle. He looked up and spoke gently, "Fräulein, it's warm here." 2 tears slid down her cheeks before she could stop them. The older nurse, Helene Bauer, tried to remain stern. She had tended to piles of dead in Warsaw, in Kiev, and Munich during the air raids. She had bandaged men without morphine, Sewn wounds closed with thread meant for clothing. She had watched prisoners in German camps die from disease, their bodies carried away like trash. And yet here she stood, staring at an American medic fitting a German soldier with a wool coat and new boots. She clenched her jaw. Something inside her was breaking. Outside, prisoners were shoveling snow with proper gloves, not shivering with bare hands. A group was constructing additional barracks out of lumber, while American engineers directed them. They were working, yes, but not collapsing in the cold. They were fed, supervised, handled not like animals, but men. There were rules here: order, cleanliness, humanity. Irmgard felt her heart pounding. She had believed, truly believed, that America treated prisoners the way the propaganda posters said: torture, starvation, cruelty. For years she had repeated it like everyone else. And here within the barbed wire the entire illusion shattered. She opened her diary that night in the small room the nurses were given and wrote, "The Americans clean their latrines twice a day. Bedding washed weekly, blankets rationed but warm. They give our wounded chocolate to help the medicine go down. They play music at dusk so the men do not go mad from silence. Who are these people? I do not understand." The next morning the nurses inspected the kitchens. They expected lies, staged food, hidden starvation. But the head cook, a mountain of a man named Sergeant Hal Briggs, dumped a full pot of stew onto the counter and barked, "Check it." They did. Meat, potatoes, carrots. More food than some German villages had seen in months. Briggs pulled out a clipboard and pointed to a schedule written in thick pencil. Breakfast, lunch, supper, calories measured. Bread counted. Every man accounted for. Helene studied the chart for a long time. "You feed them like soldiers." Briggs shrugged. "They are soldiers." Those 4 words struck harder than artillery. Outside, prisoners lined up for medical checks. The nurses watched as American doctors listened to lungs, examined wounds, and even handed out small slips of paper. Letters to families. Letters that would be delivered. Letters that would be read by mothers who may have believed their sons were already dead. Irmgard stepped forward and whispered to a young medic, Private Ellis, "Why do you allow them to write home?" Ellis blinked, confused. "Because they're men who love someone." By afternoon, the nurses realized something even more unimaginable. American guards had rules forbidding abuse. If a guard struck a prisoner without cause, it meant court-martial. Prisoners could file complaints. There were records, signatures, inspections. Germany had never believed the Americans fought with honor. But the camp was silent proof. Not everyone was convinced. Nurse Clara Stein, sharp-tongued and loyal to the fatherland, muttered that it was all staged for show. That the Americans wanted propaganda, photographs, stories to spread through Europe. But the truth kept ambushing her. She saw a German officer with frostbitten fingers receiving penicillin, medicine rarer than gold in German hospitals. She saw a priest allowed to hold a service for the prisoners. And when a prisoner collapsed from weakness while carrying lumber, 2 American soldiers ran to carry him to the infirmary. Clara stared at their faces, tired, unshaven, but careful, almost gentle. "This is not propaganda," Helene whispered. "No camera would bother to film something this ordinary." For 3 days, the nurses walked the camp, inspected buildings, checked medical logs. They saw a burial detail for men who had died before arrival, graves marked with names, not numbers. They saw a carpenter shop where prisoners built their own tables and chairs because idle men grow mad. They saw music, violins, accordions made from scrap wood and wire, and laughter. Real laughter. In a prison, at night, in their quarters, they argued. Clara accused the Americans of weakness. Irmgard accused the Reich of cruelty. Helene said nothing, because she was thinking of her husband still fighting on the Eastern Front, and wondered what camp he would end up in if he survived. On the 4th morning, snow stopped falling. The air hung still. A truck rolled into camp carrying a wounded German paratrooper, barely breathing. American doctors rushed him into the infirmary. The nurses pressed to the glass window as the medics worked, hands moving fast, voices sharp and controlled. The man's lungs rattled like broken machinery. His pulse faltered. One doctor shouted for adrenaline. Another held oxygen over his mouth. They fought for nearly an hour. They saved him. When the paratrooper opened his eyes, he whispered hoarse, "Am I in Germany?" A doctor shook his head. "No, son. But you're safe." Irmgard cried openly. Clara turned away. Helene felt something inside her chest finally collapse. The last defense of a life built on lies. This camp was not mercy for mercy's sake. It was something deeper, something the Reich had never understood. Strength did not require cruelty. America was proving it, one bandage at a time. That night, snow melted on the tin roofs, dripping like quiet tears. In the barracks, German prisoners slept under wool blankets. They dreamed not of death but of going home. And the nurses, for the first time since the war began, dreamed of peace. Cold wind rolled over the camp like a mournful breath from the ruined world beyond the fences. 3 days had passed since the German nurses arrived, and still none of them could adjust to what they were witnessing. At dawn, the prisoners lined up for roll call. Not limping skeletons, but men with coats on their backs, boots on their feet, and steam rising from cups of coffee held tight against the winter air. When the American bugle sounded, it didn't scream fear. It sounded like discipline wrapped in mercy. The nurses realized that everything here was meant to keep a man alive, not break him apart. Irmgard stood at the fence watching a group of prisoners build wooden crates. Her numb fingers clutched her diary beneath her coat, pages already filled with revelations she wasn't sure she would ever have the courage to say aloud. As she watched, a prisoner cut his hand on a splintered plank. Blood dripped into the snow, bright as berries against the white. An American guard spotted it immediately and shouted, "Medic!" The prisoner didn't run, didn't panic, didn't even look surprised. He waited. The medics came. They treated him. They told him to rest. Irmgard swallowed hard. In the Reich, a wounded prisoner was a burden. Here he was a patient. At mid-morning, trucks arrived with Red Cross supplies, bandages, antiseptic, soap, flour. The Americans unloaded first, then handed bags to the German prisoners to carry to the kitchens and infirmary. There was no shouting, no beatings, no guns waved in faces. The work moved with strange harmony, a rhythm forged by survival instead of fear. Helene, the most experienced of the nurses, moved through the infirmary taking notes. She noticed the pencils were sharp, the logs up to date, medicines portioned exact. She saw the American doctors carry themselves like men who had seen too much death and were sick of it. One doctor, Major Harold Watkins, spoke fluent German. He moved between beds checking pulse, listening to breath, adjusting doses. He treated even the most hardened SS prisoners with the same stern professionalism. A skeletal man with a shaved head and sunken eyes stared at him and muttered, "You should have let me die." Watkins leaned close. "You don't get to quit, not here." It was not cruelty, it was command. Life was a duty. Outside, the camp buzzed with routine. Guards patrolled quietly, hands resting on rifles, not clenched. Dogs sat calmly at their handlers' feet. Snow had been shoveled into neat mounds to keep paths clear. Even the latrine trenches were covered to hold back disease. For German nurses, who had cleaned overflowing hospital wards in ruined cities, this camp felt like another world. Clara Stein, still refusing to believe what she saw, marched up to the American command building and demanded to inspect the food stores again. The American quartermaster, Lieutenant John Melrose, didn't argue. He opened the doors, rolled up his sleeves, and let her inspect every crate, every sack of flour, every frozen slab of beef. He even handed her a ledger. Clara flipped through page after page of numbers, dates, rations. Everything matched. Everything was logged. There was no hidden starvation, no secret pile of stolen food. Melrose leaned against the wall and lit a cigarette. "You can check as long as you need," he said. She hated that his indifference felt like honesty. When Clara returned to the nurses' quarters, she was silent. No accusations, no skepticism, just silence, the kind that replaces certainty with shame. By afternoon, the sun melted the edges of the snow, turning the yard into slush. American soldiers organized a work detail, prisoners repairing broken crates and tents torn by wind. One older prisoner slipped on the ice and fell hard. Before, he could stand. An American soldier pulled him up, brushing snow from his coat. The prisoner nodded in thanks. Even the smallest gesture seemed unreal. Irmgard watched them, thinking of her brother, lost somewhere in the collapsing lines of the Eastern Front. Would anyone help him up if he fell? Or would he be left to freeze? As the sun lowered, the Americans did something astonishing. They opened the gates. Not to release prisoners, but to allow a German pastor from a nearby village to enter and perform evening service. He brought a worn Bible and a cracked wooden cross. Prisoners gathered, kneeling in the filthy snow, heads bowed. American guards stood at a distance, rifles lowered. The pastor prayed for sons, for fathers, for men who might never return home. He prayed for mercy. He prayed for war to end. The nurses stood behind him, and for the first time, Irmgard realized she had forgotten what faith felt like. Later in the infirmary, a new group of wounded prisoners arrived, men who had been captured only hours earlier in a skirmish near the river. Their boots were soaked with mud and blood, hands shaking from cold and hunger. The nurses rushed forward to help. American medics cut away frozen socks, wrapped blistered skin, fed spoonfuls of broth. One young SS officer, proud even in misery, refused food at first, as if accepting care was surrender. Helene knelt beside him, lifting a cup to his lips. "We are nurses," she said, "not enemies." His eyes filled with tears. He drank. Clara watched the scene, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The violence of compassion was harder to face than the violence of war. As darkness fell, the camp went still. Lights flickered in the barracks. Guards made quiet rounds. Snow drifted through the floodlights like drifting ash. Irmgard walked along the inside of the fence, her breath rising like smoke. She stopped when she saw a small group of American soldiers sitting beside a fire, boots steaming, faces tired. They spoke softly, passing around a harmonica. One of them began to play a slow tune, broken, lonely, almost mournful. Irmgard approached. The soldiers stiffened for a second, then relaxed. Private Ellis, the young medic, nodded to her, offering a place near the fire. She sat, unsure if she was allowed, but nobody asked her to leave. The music floated through the cold air, reaching even the prisoners lying in their bunks. Some hummed along, men from opposite sides of the world sharing the same melody. Ellis handed her a tin cup of coffee. She hesitated, then took it. "You thought we'd be monsters," he said quietly. Irmgard looked into the fire. "Everyone told us you were." He nodded. "Everyone told us the same about you." There was no anger, just weariness. Across the yard, Major Watkins stepped out of the infirmary, wiping his hands on his coat. He looked at the nurses with unfamiliar respect. "You worked hard today," he said in German. "Your men are alive because of it." Even Clara couldn't speak. The next morning, the reality of war returned like a shadow. American trucks brought in new prisoners captured from a bombed-out farmhouse. Some were bleeding, some were half-conscious. One carried a bundle wrapped in his coat. When he opened it, they realized it was a tiny, starved dog, shaking, ribs sharp against its fur. The Americans stared. Then someone brought water. Another brought scraps of bread. The soldiers didn't laugh. They didn't push the animal away. They saved it too. It should not have mattered. But it did, because something inhuman had infected Europe. An idea that life was cheap, replaceable, worthless. And here, inside barbed wire and guard towers, the Americans were proving the opposite. Helene found Melrose checking inventory near the supply shed. She stepped toward him, chin lifted with military posture. "There is something I do not understand," she said. Melrose raised an eyebrow. "Just one thing?" She ignored the joke. "Why treat our men so well? They kill yours, they bomb your towns, they would not do the same for you." Melrose leaned back against a wooden crate. His answer was simple. "Because someday the war ends, and the world will remember how we acted when we held the power." Helene stared at him, stunned, because it was true, because she knew what Germany would be remembered for. That night, a blizzard swept over the camp. Wind howled against the wooden walls. The American guards rotated shifts every hour, so no man froze at his post. Prisoners were given extra blankets. The kitchen worked past midnight boiling potatoes and onions. Simple food, but hot. The nurses walked the barracks with lanterns, checking for frostbite, fever, nightmares. When a prisoner bolted upright from a dream, screaming in panic, Irmgard sat beside him, holding his hand until he slept. By dawn, the storm had passed. Snow piled high along the fences. Smoke curled from chimneys. The camp looked almost peaceful, if one ignored the barbed wire. But war did not forget this place. It never did. Because outside the camp, Germany was breaking. Cities were burning, armies collapsing, refugees freezing on roads that led nowhere. The nurses knew they would soon be ordered to leave. The Americans knew it too. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt the same strange truth. When this war was judged, not by bullets but by memory, places like this camp would matter more than any battlefield. Night still hung over the camp when the sirens began to wail. It started as a distant moan carried by the wind, so faint the nurses thought it might be a dream. But the sound grew, long, metallic, rising through the frozen air like a wounded animal. Guards sprinted from their posts. Prisoners jolted awake. The floodlights snapped on, slicing light across the snow. The nurses stepped onto the wooden porch of the infirmary, just as the American commander, Captain Royce Harrington, shouted orders. "Incoming wounded convoy. Prepare the infirmary, all stations ready." The camp had always been orderly, but now it pulsed with urgency. Trucks barreled through the gate, engines spraying mud and slush. Their canvas flaps were soaked in blood torn by bullets. Prisoners were rushed out first. Many captured hours ago, some carried in blankets, some crawling, some delirious. But then the nurses saw something new. American wounded. Bodies wrapped in field coats, faces pale, bandages dark with fresh blood. These were not enemies. These were men Irmgard had shared coffee with, joked with, tended beside. And now they were broken. The American doctors did not hesitate. The infirmary swarmed, scalpels, morphine, boiling water. Prisoners who could walk dragged stretchers. Guards tore open crates of supplies. No one stopped to remind anyone who belonged on which side of the war. The line between them vanished in the snow. Helene found herself kneeling beside a dying American soldier. His breath rattled shallow and sharp, a metallic scent of blood filling his lungs. She pressed a cloth to his chest, whispering words she never imagined speaking to an Allied soldier. Hold on, Junge. Do not leave." Across the room, Clara worked with ferocity, stitching a shrapnel wound on a German sergeant while Major Watkins bound gauze around an American corporal. A German prisoner handed Watkins a scalpel with steady hands. Watkins nodded, thanking him as if he were another doctor on staff. Irmgard felt the strange weight of the moment, a room filled with men who should have hated one another, now fighting not against each other but against death itself. Outside, snow fell again, thick and heavy, muffling the cries of pain. The camp was silent except for boots pounding the ground and the engines of trucks arriving with more wounded. Major Watkins shouted across the ward, "We're out of morphine!" Melrose sprinted to the supply shed. Minutes later, he crashed back inside, arms loaded with glass vials and bandages. He tossed them to nurses like ammunition on a battlefield, every cot filled. Every corner of the infirmary became an operating table. The nurses' hands shook with the cold, their breath turning to frost as they worked. The air smelled of sweat, blood, iodine, and smoke. Lamps hissed with low flickering flame. Someone cried softly in German. Someone else prayed in English. Helene had worked in the worst hospitals of the Eastern Front, but she had never seen anything like this. A synchronized desperation, a quiet agreement that saving lives mattered more than uniforms, flags, or oaths. Hours passed. Then the screaming stopped. For a moment, only wind moved through the cracks in the wooden walls. Dozens of wounded now slept. Some stabilized, others deep in morphine sleep, others alive only through sheer force of will. The floor was slick with water and footprints. The lanterns burned low. Captain Harrington entered with his cap in his hands, face hollow from exhaustion. He looked at the nurses, German women, his former enemies, and spoke with a voice rough as gravel. "You saved my men tonight." Clara, still shaking from adrenaline, stared at him. In that instant, the propaganda she'd been fed for years, American savages, American monsters, evaporated. She saw him not as a uniform but a man. But the night was not finished. At dawn, a prisoner collapsed near the gate. His face was blue with frostbite, his pulse thready. But when the medics lifted his shirt, they found something else, a festering bullet wound packed with dirty cloth. He had hidden it for days, terrified the Americans would execute him if they discovered he was part of a Waffen-SS unit. The nurses gathered around, Helene in command. She ordered the wound cleaned. Watkins frowned, suspicious. "Why hide it?" he asked. The prisoner trembled. "I killed Americans." "You will kill me," no one spoke. The silence was violent. Then Watkins responded, "You're a patient. That's all you are in here." The nurses watched as tears spilled down the prisoner's face, not from pain but from disbelief. He let them operate. For 2 hours they worked, cutting away dead flesh, packing the wound, saving a man who had sworn death to the flag above their heads. When it was over, Irmgard stepped outside, shaking. Snow crunched under her boots. The morning sky glowed pale gold. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she saw beauty in the world. From the guard tower, Private Ellis waved to her and called down. "It's quiet out there." "Too quiet," she nodded. The war was like a storm receding, not gone, just waiting to return. Later that afternoon, a supply plane roared overhead. Prisoners stopped working to stare. Some flinched, expecting bombs. Instead, crates parachuted down, thudding into the snow. Food, medicine, blankets, chocolate bars that soldiers tossed to prisoners as they passed. One prisoner caught a bar and stared at it like it was treasure. "We are fed better here than at home," he whispered. Irmgard swallowed the guilt rising in her throat. She thought of her mother in Leipzig, hungry, cold, amputating scraps of bread to feed her younger siblings. How could a prison camp feel richer than a German city? Even Clara could not deny it anymore. She broke down while scrubbing surgical tools in boiling water. "Why do they do this?" she cried. "Why must they show us what we should have been?" Helene placed a hand on her shoulder. "Because they are winning," she said quietly, "and they want to win with dignity." That evening, the Americans organized something impossible. Letters home. They brought paper and pencils to the barracks. Prisoners sat at tables writing to wives, mothers, children. The nurses collected the pages, and the Americans stamped them with Red Cross approval. Irmgard helped a young soldier who could barely write his own name. His hands shook as he whispered, "I thought my family believed me dead." She steadied his hand. "Not anymore." As the sun set, pink and gold over the snow, prisoners lined up at the fences, not to escape, but to watch the sky darken in silence. There were no gunshots, no screams, just a strange peace. When night fully arrived, Helene walked the length of the camp, her boots crunching softly. American guards stood alert but calm. In the barracks, prisoners slept curled beneath blankets. In the infirmary, wounded breathed steadily under warm lamps. For the first time since the invasion of Poland, Helene felt something other than exhaustion or grief. She felt hope. The winter did not break gently, it shattered. A sudden warm front swept across the valley, turning snow into rivers of mud. The fences sagged under melting drifts, guard dogs splashed through puddles, and the entire camp seemed to sink into the thawing earth. With the snow gone, the scars of war emerged. Cracked helmets half buried in slush, splintered planks from old barracks, rusted shell fragments glinting like teeth in the dirt. The world was waking, but it was an ugly awakening. With the thaw came sickness, not starvation, not wounds, disease. The kind that moved invisibly silently faster than bullets. Typhus. It started with a fevered prisoner whose sheets were drenched in sweat. Then another, and another. Within hours, the infirmary was overwhelmed not by bleeding men from battle, but by shivering bodies trembling under blankets. German nurses recognized the signs immediately. Sunken eyes, cracked lips, a smell like sour milk and rot. A nightmare they had seen in German camps. A nightmare that killed by the dozens. A nightmare without mercy. Helene ordered immediate quarantine. The American doctors agreed, sealing off an entire barracks. Guards stretched canvas barriers. Prisoners carried buckets of lime to disinfect the latrines, and every nurse scrubbed their hands until their skin cracked. Typhus had no allegiance. It killed Germans and Americans the same. For the first time, Irmgard saw fear in American eyes. The camp became silent except for coughing, dry, bitter, endless coughing that echoed through the wooden walls. Prisoners lay sweating, shaking, whispering prayers into the darkness. The nurses moved cot to cot, cooling foreheads, spooning water past cracked lips. They slept only in stolen moments, collapsing on benches, rising again when someone screamed. A German prisoner named Eric Thompson, gaunt and half-conscious, clutched Irmgard's sleeve. "Will they let us die?" She shook her head. No, not here, but she was not certain. No one was. Major Watkins paced the infirmary, jaw clenched tight. Supplies were low: disinfectants, clean linen, quinine. He snapped orders to the guards to send radio requests for more medical stock. He even tore sheets from his own bedding to make bandages. His voice never wavered, but his hands trembled. The disease spread faster than help arrived. Within 2 days, 20 men burned with fever. On the third day, 40. A German corporal died before dawn, lungs full of fluid. The nurses carried his body wrapped in cloth, burying him behind the barracks with a wooden cross. Irmgard carved his name by hand, fingers bleeding from the cold. She prayed she would not need to carve another. But death is never satisfied with one. On the 5th day, an American guard collapsed outside the mess hall. When they carried him in, the camp fell into a deep, dreadful silence. This was no longer a German problem. The virus had crossed the invisible line between prisoner and guard, proving that war had never mattered to it at all. Captain Harrington addressed the camp at dusk. His voice boomed across the yard, echoing against tin roofs. "No one leaves. No one disobeys quarantine. We fight this with discipline or we lose everything." To the nurses' shock, the prisoners obeyed. No riots, no escape attempts. They had learned to trust their captors. The camp worked together like a single wounded creature. Prisoners shoveled snowmelt away from latrines. American soldiers built isolation rooms from scrap lumber. German medics who had once served the Wehrmacht now followed American doctors without hesitation. The disease was the enemy, not each other. Helene, exhausted beyond reason, leaned over a burning fever victim and whispered, "Breathe, Junge, breathe." She remembered saying those same words in Warsaw, in Kiev, in Munich, places where bodies piled faster than prayers. But here something was different. They were not giving up. Irmgard spent hours sterilizing water. She boiled buckets on iron stoves until her hands blistered from the heat. Prisoners lined up to drink cup by cup, their eyes full of desperate gratitude. One elderly soldier, gray-bearded and shaking, pressed her hand and whispered, "You are saving us." She walked away so he would not see her cry. Outside, Clara sat on a crate, wrapping bandages around her fingers where the skin had split. Private Ellis approached, worry etched into his face. "You should rest," Clara laughed bitterly. "And who will save your men if I do?" Even she didn't recognize her own voice anymore. That night, storm clouds rolled overhead. Rain battered the roofs like artillery fire. The nurses lay in their bunks, unable to sleep. Sweat, fever, coughing, footsteps, every sound carried panic. The storm raged until dawn, turning the yard into a swamp of mud and misery. At first light, a jeep arrived from headquarters. A medic jumped out shouting for Watkins. He carried a wooden crate marked with red stamps, vaccine. The infirmary erupted. Nurses sobbed. Prisoners cheered. Guards hugged each other. It felt like salvation delivered in splintered wood and glass vials. Vaccination began immediately. Prisoners lined up single file, sleeves rolled. No one protested. No one resisted. They offered their arms in absolute silence. The needle pierced skin after skin, hope replacing fear. Irmgard injected the vaccine into the arm of a prisoner who once refused to speak to Americans. He looked into her eyes and whispered, "I want to live." Within 48 hours, the fever broke in the strongest men. Within 72, the dying slowed. Within a week, the infirmary was no longer a tomb. The worst had passed. The day the last fever receded, the entire camp exhaled at once. Prisoners sat in the yard, pale and thin but alive. American guards leaned against guard posts, eyes closed in relief. Nurses walked among the men, checking pulses, offering bread, smiling without realizing it. Helene stood outside, hands buried in her coat pockets. She watched the camp with a strange ache in her chest. She had spent years watching people die. For the first time, she had watched them live. Nearby, Captain Harrington approached with Melrose. You saved this camp, Harrington said. Helene shook her head. We all did. For once, there was no uniform between them, just humanity. When the sun set, prisoners began to sing. Not marching songs. Not war songs. Folk songs. Soft, sorrowful melodies from Rhineland, Bavaria, Saxony. Songs of homes they might never see again. American guards listened in silence, some bowing their heads. Irmgard leaned against the fence, listening as voices rose into the cold night. She opened her diary and wrote, "If mercy is a weapon, it wins more hearts than bullets." In the distance, artillery thundered. The war was still coming, but inside the fences of this forgotten camp, a different battle had been won. Spring did not arrive with green grass and warm skies. It arrived with the sound of engines. The nurses heard them first, a distant rumble rolling over the hills like thunder. Prisoners lifted their heads. Guards froze at their posts. Captain Harrington stepped out of the command hut, binoculars raised. Beyond the horizon, dust rose into the air. Columns, long and dark, moving fast. American armor. Convoys. Infantry. Trucks filled with supplies and wounded. The front was shifting. The war, which had felt so far away just weeks earlier, was suddenly at the camp's doorstep. The gates opened. Dozens of American soldiers poured in, exhausted. Mud-covered, uniforms torn by artillery shrapnel. Their faces were hollow, their boots ruined, some missing fingers from frostbite. They were not triumphant heroes. They were men who had seen hell and walked out only because their legs had not yet given up. With them came prisoners, new German captives, staggering, skeletal, terrified. The war outside was collapsing, town by town, road by road. In the east, Germans fled the Red Army. In the west, they fled thunderous air raids and tank assaults. The Reich was dying, but it refused to die quietly. Helene saw the convoy and felt her pulse quicken. More wounded meant more chaos. More fever, more death. But that was not the worst part. An American lieutenant approached Harrington, speaking too fast, too pale. "They're coming," he said. "SS units. Last push east. They'll kill everyone in their path." Prisoners heard it. Some dropped to their knees. Others whispered prayers. The SS was not coming to rescue anyone. They were coming to erase witnesses, German prisoners who had seen mercy. Germans who had seen Americans behave like human beings, not monsters. A story like that could spread, and the Reich could not allow it. Captain Harrington's jaw turned to stone. He ordered all able prisoners and soldiers to begin fortifying the camp. Barrels filled with sand, overturned tables, makeshift barricades. Everyone worked. No one questioned. Snowmelt turned the ground beneath their boots into thick, sucking mud. The guards hauled ammunition crates. Prisoners stacked lumber. Nurses carried buckets of water and linens to the infirmary. The sky turned the color of steel, wind cutting like knives. Irmgard's hands shook as she wrapped bandages, but she did not stop. She had watched these men live. She would not watch them die. By dusk, the horizon glowed with orange fire, villages burning in the distance. The thunder of artillery rolled closer, rattling tin roofs and shaking lanterns on the walls. The guard dogs whimpered, pressing against their handlers. Then far down the road, gunfire. Short bursts at first, then longer, then screams too faint to understand. In the watchtower, Private Ellis gripped his rifle with both trembling hands. He had never fired at anything that wasn't wearing an enemy uniform. Prisoners huddled behind crates, pale, silent, shaking. Helene stood outside the infirmary, cold wind whipping her coat. She had no rifle, no way to stop whatever came, but she remained where she was, rooted like a tree refusing to fall. Captain Harrington walked the yard, voice low and calm. "No one runs. No one breaks. We hold this place until backup arrives," Clara whispered to Irmgard. "Backup? Will they come?" Irmgard didn't answer. She didn't know. The first shot hit the fence, wood splintering, barbed wire vibrating. The guards opened fire from the towers. Prisoners dove for cover. A mortar shell exploded near the far barracks, showering the yard in burning debris. The camp became a battlefield. American soldiers knelt behind sandbags, rifles snapping with flame. Prisoners dragged the wounded inside, not caring whether the uniform was gray or green. Helene patched a bullet wound on an American's leg while Clara held his trembling shoulders. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes turning the blood on the ground into dark slush. Every explosion shook the earth. Every scream cut the night. The SS were moving closer, firing through the wire, bullets cracking against metal and bone. Harrington's voice roared through the chaos. "We do not abandon the infirmary." Irmgard looked through the window. Pale faces, weak bodies, men too injured to crawl to safety. If the barricades broke, they would be slaughtered. Every single one. She ran outside, grabbing a wooden plank and hammering it across the entrance. Prisoners joined her, nailing more boards, stacking crates, building a shield between the wounded and the coming storm. Men who once served Hitler now defended the infirmary of an American camp. The world had turned upside down. A prisoner with shaking hands asked, "Why are we helping them?" Another answered, "Because they saved us." Gunfire lit the night, flashes of white and orange cutting through black. The SS pushed forward, determined, relentless. But the camp held. Every American bullet was placed with precision. Every prisoner who could fight passed ammunition, hauled crates, dragged sandbags. Hours passed like years. At midnight, rain began, icy needles slicing through smoke. The mud deepened. The ground turned to sludge. The wind howled like artillery. The SS fired one last volley. Then silence, no footsteps, no engines, no voices, only breath. Only the slow drip of rain from the rafters. Harrington signaled ceasefire. For 10 long seconds, the camp didn't breathe. Then, from the North Road, the growl of engines, American engines. Trucks and armored cars burst through darkness. Headlights cutting through rain. Reinforcements. Soldiers leaped from the trucks, forming perimeter lines. The SS had fled into the woods, leaving behind their dead. The attack was over. The nurses emerged from the infirmary into the rain, faces pale, uniforms soaked, hands bloody. Prisoners sat in the mud, shaking from exhaustion and disbelief. Captain Harrington walked to the center of the yard and lowered his head. They had held, not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most armed, but because they refused to let cruelty reclaim the camp. By dawn, the rain stopped. The sky turned soft gray. Bodies were buried, Americans and Germans side by side. Irmgard helped dig. So did Clara. So did the prisoners. There were no speeches, no hatred, only quiet. When the last mound of earth was patted flat, an American soldier planted a crude cross made from scrap wood. A prisoner stepped forward and placed a torn field cap on the ground beside it. Helene closed her eyes. This was not victory. This was survival. Later that morning, news reached the camp. American forces had broken through the last German lines. The war was ending. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The Reich was collapsing, cities surrendering, flags falling. The prisoners gathered in the yard. Some wept openly. Others stared at the mountains, imagining home. The Americans unlocked the gates, not to release them yet, but to remove the fence's power. No one tried to run. There was nowhere left to run to. Helene packed her medical kit. Clara folded her coat. Irmgard stood at the gate, breathing air that no longer tasted like fear. Major Watkins approached them. "You will be transported to a hospital in the West," he said gently. "You won't be prisoners. You'll be staff," Helene nodded. Clara wiped her eyes. Irmgard whispered, "Thank you." The convoy formed. Engines rumbled to life. Prisoners loaded into trucks. Thin, tired, but alive. Irmgard climbed into a transport vehicle, looking back through the open gate. The camp stood in the gray morning, battered but quiet. A place built for imprisonment had become a place that saved lives. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting through barbed wire that no longer mattered. As the trucks rolled away, Private Ellis raised his hand to his brow in a silent salute. Irmgard pressed her face to the glass, returning it. The road stretched before them, disappearing into mist and the broken world beyond. They did not know what waited: hospitals, ruins, families dead or alive. But they carried something the Reich could not erase. Proof that mercy existed. Proof that honor survived war. Proof that even behind barbed wire, humanity did not die. The engines roared. The convoy rolled forward. The camp faded behind trees and fog, and somewhere far across the torn continent, bells began to ring, because the war was ending. And the world would never be the same.